Okay. Thank you. It's really wonderful to be back and to receive such a warm welcome and to be in such a good place. You guys really have something good going here. And I've been telling people that based on my visit last year. So today I'm going to talk about this new project. I'm going to start with a film. The first cabinet that opened when I wanted it to was the chest of drawers. I only had to pull the knob and the door snapped out of its lock to meet me. And the shirts, aprons, and undershirts that were stored there, I found what made the chest of drawers an adventure for me. I had to make my way to the farthest corner. Then I came across my socks, which lay there in heaps, rolled and wrapped in the traditional way. Each pair had the appearance of a small pocket. There was nothing like the pleasure of sinking my hand as deeply as possible into its interior. I did not do this for the sake of its warmth. It was the little present, which I always held on the rolled up inside, that drew me into its depths. When I held it in my fist, and to the best of my ability confirmed my possession of the soft woolen mouse, the second part of the game began, which brought the revelation. For now I would set about unwrapping the present from its woolen pocket. I drew it closer and closer to me until a striking thing happened. I had drawn out the present, but that pocket in which it had lain was no longer there. I could not repeat this experiment often enough. It taught me that form and content, covering and what is covered, are the same thing. It led me to pull the truth out of literature as carefully as the child's hand had pulled the sock from my pocket. Okay, so that's one of the films that I've made to date. I think this is the simplest one and the shortest, but I think it conveys the basic structure that I'm working with. There's the
the actual text from Benjamin. One of the texts that's in this book, Berlin Childhood, around 1900, and then working with that, reading the text either in English or in German, with corresponding subtitles, and then seeing where the film goes with the images. And I think I'm going to further develop this film because we just have the text itself, but I want to have a later section that reflects on Benjamin's approach to truth, to language, to his own interpretive strategies. But I need time to think that through. As you can anticipate, it's a very complicated subject matter. But that perhaps gives you a sense of it. And so now I'm going to sort of delve into what I've been engaged with, and show you a few other images and clips. And then we're going to end with another film, which is about 15 minutes, which is titled Der Mond, the Moon. Okay. So we're going to go to the PowerPoint now. Okay. And I use this mouse. Okay. So this is the title that we've already talked about. So this is a project that I started last winter, as some of you heard me mention it during my visit last year. I'm living in Berlin now, and I thought this would be an interesting project to delve into. I wasn't sure if it was going to work, but it seems to be working all right. And so the whole premise is to create a series of films that reflects on the book by Walter Benjamin. This is one of the German versions of it, and then this is English translation. And I probably won't be making films on all of the different texts, but the ones that most interest me and seeing how it goes. So part of the larger idea involved is to create this kind of mosaic of different films that are interrelated with one another in terms of the themes, the images involved, the histories involved, which is very much the case with the book itself. So I've been doing a lot of, but how do I get to a next slide like that? Okay, that worked. Yeah. Oh, that might be easier. Yeah. Okay. So these are just some images of Benjamin. I'm sure you're all familiar with him and aspects of his life and work. This is him as a child with his parents, his sister Dora. His father was a successful businessman, and he lived in what they started living when Benjamin was born in what's known as West Berlin, which is the area around Potsdamer Platz now, just south of there. And as the father became more successful and accomplished and more secure financially, they moved further and further out. They moved to Charlottenburg and then even further out. This is Benjamin, I think, seated, and then this is his brother Stefan and Dora again. And this is a lovely picture of him too, as a young boy. This is the main text that I've been working with. It's very convenient. I can move about Berlin with it to check different passages and take it with me on travels. And this is the main English translation, translated by Howard Island, who I actually met in January before I came to Berlin. He's a friend actually of Michael D. Jackson, the anthropologist. They're good friends, and Michael introduced me. And it's been wonderful to talk with Howard, and I've been sending him different versions of the film and getting his thoughts on how to approach them. So this is the foreword to the whole text, the English translation. Benjamin writes, and it's worth noting that this was written in what is known as the 1938 version. In 1932, when I was abroad, it began to be clear to me that I would soon have to bid a long, perhaps lasting farewell to the city of my birth. So, he's writing at the beginning of the 1930s, and it's clear with the rise of fascism in Germany and other places that he might not be able to return. And he was living largely in Paris then, but also he was going to Ibiza. He was living in Italy. And then, so he continues. Several times in my inner life, I've already experienced the process of inoculation as something salutary. In this situation, too, I resolved to follow suit, and I deliberately called to mind those images which, in exile, are most apt to awaken homelessness, images of childhood. My assumption was that the feeling of longing would no more gain mastery over my spirit than a vaccine does over a healthy body. I sought to limit its effects through insight into the irretrievability, not the contingent biographical, but the necessary social irretrievability of the past. And can you hear me okay? Or you are? Okay. So some things to note is, one, he's looking for images of his childhood, but also this very striking metaphor of injecting himself with these images, almost like an inoculation, because if he takes on a few images into his body, into his system, he can live with it in a way, and he can move on and deal with the longing and the sense of exile that he has engaged with. And then he goes on to say, this has meant that certain biographical features, which stand out more readily in the continuity of experience than its depths, altogether recede in the present undertaking. So he doesn't really describe his mother so much. She's a presence there, but it's not a typical kind of social realist portrait, or of his mother, or of other people. And with them go the physiognomies, those of my family and comrades alike. On the other hand, I've made an effort to get hold of the images in which the experience of the big city is precipitated in a child of the middle class. So the whole book is, each section of the book is predicated on a particular image that's at the core of that text. And the term, I'll get back to this later, is he was working with the concept of what he called the Denkbild, which is sort of, I think, could be translated as thought image, or figure of thought. And each text is predicated on a particular core image. And you'll see that reflected. So the film we saw, the core image is the sock, and this play between the outer form of it and the inner form. The play between what he calls the cover and what is covered. And so I've been working with that too. And so my effort as well is to try to get hold of the images, that got hold of Benjamin, and he was trying to get hold of 100 years after he was, living and writing and working on this text. And so that's been my endeavor in Berlin. To, as I note here, so to draw from Benjamin's ideas and writings to craft a series of films about his childhood. And in some ways, I think of it as field work in filmmaking. I'm really sort of doing this filmmaking from a kind of anthropological sensibility. And I think, there's many anthropologists in this room, and we're just trained to see the world and live the world and engage with the world anthropologically. So I'm sort of almost like taking implicit field notes of what's happening, and perhaps I'll write about it. It's also a kind of phenomenology of filmmaking. What is it like for me to do the filming, the editing, to engage with this material? And a key concept for me that has arisen is what I've been thinking of as multimodal phenomenality, which I'll talk more about later on. And this is a quick translation, definition. This pertains to phenomenal moments and streams of life appearing in multiple interrelated modalities through complex currents of time. And I think film implicitly carries that. It carries these streams of life, these phenomenal streams through sound or vision. And for me, film becomes a concept to engage with that possibility of how to think about the world. But I'll describe that in more tangible terms later. Again, this it's quite possible I took this film the last time I came to Halle, either on the trip there or on the way back. And I'm basically looking for a lot of different materials, like a field worker would, an ethnographer. You're not sure how it's going to be used, but you take field notes, on a cooking recipe or a folk tale, and eventually you might sort of draw from it. So I'm constantly sort of collecting images in this way. And so this is the key question, which I think I raised last year when I was here, a kind of key question for me, how we might go about understanding the complicated and ever-shifting nuances of bodily experience, sensory perception, consciousness, relationality, and memory, time, and history in our lives and the lives of others. So this is the focus of the film, and I'm thinking about Benjamin's life. How did he make sense of his life? How did he attend to this question? And how can I attend to it as well through the filmmaking as well, and through this complex historical expanse of time. These are some of the sections of the book. Some of you might be familiar with it. This is actually from, and it's important to note this, from the 1938, what's known as the final version. And I don't know how you would pronounce this in German, Pariser Typoscript? Typoscript? The Parisian typescript. And this is actually the version that was a typewritten version. Others were written by, most of the other earlier ones were written by hand. And Agamben, the Italian philosopher, found this in the archives or the library collection of the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And I think what happened is when Benjamin was leaving Paris in 1940, he gave a lot of his written texts to Bataille, who worked at the library. And Bataille hid them in the library. And just by chance, Agamben came across it. And so this is seen as the final version. One thing to note is all the different versions are distinct. And I've been working with that. And I'll talk about that more too. But these are the different things. And these are the films I've made today. Each film has taken about like a month to make, except for the one you saw today, in part because I'm learning how to do it. And I'm trying to figure out like different arrangements of the images and the sequences. So there's the Kaiser Panorama, which I showed briefly last year. The film Boys Books, which I'll show tomorrow. Der Mond, the moon, which I'll show today. And we saw the sock, and Das Bucklige Männlein, the hunchback little man or the little hunchback. And I'm working now on the film Departure and Return, which I'll show tomorrow too. And we could talk about it. So some considerations to keep in mind with the text is that they were written while Benjamin was in exile from 1932 on. He never returned to Berlin. And he was writing this during the rise of the Nazi regime of Germany. And you can see implicit dimensions of this within the writing. And the scholars who've written about this have described this text as an anti-fascist manual. And they're doing it in a very kind of complex conceptual way. But there's disturbances constantly, disturbances of subjectivity, of stability, of identity that work against what the National Socialists were advancing at the time in Germany. The other thing to know is Benjamin had thought about suicide, I think around 1929, 1930. And then when he was working on this book, those thoughts faded, from my understanding. And so one possibility is that this brought him back to life in a way, to think about his childhood. And in some ways, it's a very joyful book. He talks about his wonder and about amazement of different things within his life as a child. But there is also this darker tone to the text too that we can talk about. So I mentioned the Denkbild, the thought image or figure of thought. One thing that scholars have noted, and I can see that as well, that this photographic motifs recur throughout the text. And we'll see this in the film The Moon, because the moon shines into the bedroom of a boy when he's trying to sleep at night, almost like it's a camera obscura. There's a light, an optical device that's coming into it. The writing is very ornate and complex. When I started working with friends and colleagues in Berlin and asked them to read some text, and they said, this is difficult prose, even for a native reader and speaker of German. And that's, I think, intentional. It was the way Benjamin wrote more generally, but it's also very sensorially rich. And that's why I think it works well for the films, because everything he's invoking is often image-based. And then I can find images in one way or another that somehow reflect on it. And the manuscript went unpublished during his lifetime. He tried to get it published, but he was unsuccessful, in part because of the rise of fascism in Germany. And that's one reason he left Germany, because he was finding it difficult to get published, and he needed to support himself and his family. So the other thing to note is the palimpsestic quality of the text, and of writing, language, thought, place, and time, and memory in life more generally. And this is a key theme I want to talk about today. So just to be clear, a palimpsest is usually known as a text of some sort, a piece like a parchment, in prehistorical times, or in historical times, where some kind of writing would be put on, and then he would fade or it'd be effaced or erased in some ways, and there'd be another layer of inscription, and then another layer after that. So through time, you get a complex sort of field of inscriptions and erasures with the same material structure. And this is just a definition. We don't have to get into this. This is another example, the codex, and some of you might be familiar with these. And this is just a kind of complete page. But I think in Benjamin's life, and with this text in particular, there's many palimpsests involved. One is sort of the qualities of this book, the Berliner Kindheit. And I just came across this quote from Scholem this morning. As far as I know, he rewrote many pieces 7 or 8 times. He was writing to a journal talking about the text. These are different versions, for instance, of the text. And this is put together, this is organized by the Walter Benjamin Archive that's put together these wonderful collections of books. And so you could see another thing he wrote was Berlin Chronicle, which was an earlier autobiographical text of Benjamin, in part written, dedicated to his son. But it's more of this kind of narrative of the events of his life. And he shifted away from that with the Berlin childhood book. So you have this is the kind of scholars' definitions of the different ones leading up to this text, which is the main publication today. If you go into a bookstore, it's very easy to get a version, and I've seen these in bookstores, of the Felicitas exemplar, because that was the version that was published, the first version, which was published by Adorno, or Adorno facilitated the publication, because he was unaware of this other typescript, Parisian typescript, which is actually shorter and edited. But we're really dealing with these different versions, which is really interesting to work with as well. Most of the earlier versions are handwritten. This is like one page of it. And this is an archive. If any of you want the link, I could send it to you. And they've done this wonderful job of scanning all of these. And then you can actually use a slider, and it converts over into typewritten face in German. So you can actually see. And I asked them, I said, it must have been difficult to make out this handwriting. They said, no, you get used to it. After a while, you just get familiar with his style of writing. But it's a really wonderful, so they basically sort of translated all of this, and it's on the text now. And then there's these very scholarly texts that have all these different translations with wonderful footnotes that explain different, people that he's writing about or places. So there's also the palimpsestic qualities of Benjamin's writings more generally. And again, I'm drawing from scholars. So Michael Jennings, a key Benjaminian scholar, writes, I don't have to read the whole thing, but you read something of Benjamin's and then you're reminded of something he wrote about in One Way Street. And then you read something else, and that's a passage in Arcade's project. And then you read something and you see it's an earlier version of the Berlin childhood. Or you read the latest version here, and then you go back and you see it's different in an earlier version, or he's taken something out of an earlier version. And so there's really his whole writing in general, not just the autobiographical writings, his whole corpus of writing is very palimpsestic, just layers and layers of inscriptions and erasures that are interrelated to one another. And in some ways, I think Benjamin was palimpsestic. You know, Jennings and Ireland, who wrote a very good, no, maybe I don't even know the source of this quote, but it's a common quote, that Benjamin himself was a contradictory and mobile whole. I think maybe he was referring to himself in that way, but I haven't found the source of that. Ireland and Jennings describe an untoward complexity of character. And Adorno says he immerses himself in reality as in a palimpsest. And you can see that with this book. It's a palimpsest of a particular life world of a child, but it's embedded in the history of Germany from the 19th century on to the early 20th century. And then now I'm coming along and sort of stepping into that palimpsest, trying to find my bearings and perhaps adding to it or effacing certain parts. And then we also have Berlin. And some of you have lived in Berlin. Perhaps you would agree it's very palimpsestic. Any street or neighborhood you walk along, there's traces of the past. Some traces have been effaced, and you can even retrace the traces. But every neighborhood has these elements of 19th century, earlier, of early 20th century, you know, through the 20th century and up until the present age. And this is one of the things that I find fascinating about Berlin. It's so palimpsestic. And this is just some street art that somehow reflects that. And to give you a sense of a kind of tangible sense of this is just a quick film that I did in the Park am Gleisdreieck, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. I think it means triangle track park, right? And this is where different train lines had once run, and now there's an S-Bahn train that runs through it. But you can just see almost like layers built into the landscape. And there's still features there of what was there 100 years ago. There's much more modern features. The park itself is very new, but I think these back buildings in the background have probably been there over 100 years. They were part of the larger train network, which I'll talk about more. So this is one of the things I'm engaging with, which actually I find really interesting. And again, there's someone has written about this. Andreas Huyssen has written a book called Present and Past, Urban Palimpsests and the Politics of Memory, and there's a whole chapter on Berlin. And he talks about, what is emerging as the more intriguing notion of Berlin is palimpsest. And he was writing in 2003. And in that book, he talks about Potsdamer Platz. He says, like, who knows what's going to come of it? There's plans to redevelop it. And now it's completely redeveloped. It's like this postmodern, urban center, within the center of Berlin. But this is the whole idea that Berlin as palimpsest implies voids, illegibilities, and erasures. But it also offers a richness of traces and memories, restorations, and new constructions that will mark the city as lived space. So I think in a lot of the way I'm thinking of it, a lot of sort of neighborhoods and places in Berlin, there's these kind of material spectral reverberations. There's these material objects that still exist, but they have these kind of spectral sort of dimensions or aspects of them. And then I think we can also think of history as palimpsestic. These historical recesses, complexities, layers, and folds, not just in Berlin, but in probably every place in the world. And that's something to keep in mind too. And then also the palimpsest involved in making the films. There's different forms of perception, the memories of filmmaking, what's included in the films and what's left out, what's perceived and what is not perceived, and perhaps even in perceiving the films. So in a sense, I think we could say that the filmic endeavors engage with a complicated and ever-shifting field of perceptions, sensations, presences, and absences. And the question I have for you all today is, would you see your own research, the subjects of your research, leading to a similar kind of sort of observation? Do you work with palimpsests yourself in terms of time, history, peoples, lands? And so this is just a summary of the different palimpsestic qualities involved. And then to quote Howard Island, describing the book itself, each of the moments invoked communicates with and subtly overlaps with the others, as the multiply exposed images in a film bleed into one another in a composite transparency. And one reason I'm using this film is because he alludes to films, and I'm trying to do something similar with that. But with every text, it's almost like, to invoke Bakhtin, there's a kind of intertextuality, this dialogue between the different texts, and then different versions of the text too. So the question I have for myself is how to craft a series of interrelated films that convey the sense of palimpsestic thought, writing, perception, experience, time and memory, and thus of life itself. There's a verb, if you look at like the Oxford English Dictionary I learned recently, to palimpsest. At least it can be used in that way. to make into a palimpsest, to write anew. So the question I've been asking is, can one palimpsest through films? Can you create a kind of palimpsestic experience for the viewer of time, of memory, of space? And I don't have a good answer to it. I'm not sure, and I don't think I've been successful yet, but that's one of the trajectories, one of the directions I'd like to work through. And how might one do so and thus create a palimpsestic effect through a film? I think perhaps some filmmakers do that in very successful ways. And so what I find most compelling, these are some of the things I find most compelling in Benjamin's thought and writings more generally. One is the relevance of all this for critical phenomenology, which, as I spoke about last year, is a analytic framework that I identify with and try to contribute to. And each line of his thought and analysis provides an opening. Arendt described Benjamin's writing as creating open positions. Nothing is ever completely closed off or concluded, but it just opens up possibilities, and sometimes they contradict one another. When people have talked to me about why I work with Benjamin instead of Heidegger, say, or Hannah Arendt, is Benjamin makes sense to me. There's a kind of intuitive feel. And I think we can all relate to thinkers that we have a kind of intuitive resonance with. And I like Benjamin's approach. I read Benjamin for the first time when I was working on the book on the homeless shelter, and the way he described urban life and the nature of perception and experience resonated well with me. And so, but I stopped reading him for some years, and I've come back to him. And for me, it's more a general orientation for thinking and writing than any of the specific ideas involved. I think Benjamin, along with other people, created the foundation of cultural studies, like including Krokauer at that time, writing a very similar time of Benjamin, look at cultural objects in the world and analyze them in a kind of critical way. I also think of Walter Benjamin as a critical phenomenologist, or perhaps a proto-critical phenomenologist, in that he really looks at these phenomena, but in a kind of critical way. Everything he's looking at, from film to photography, to architecture, to the flaneur, to Baudelaire's poetry, he's looking at the phenomena involved, but he's trying to analyze it in a kind of critical way, drawing out the political, the social and historical sort of implications of it. And so that's one way I think of him. I think we can skip this. He also is very close attention to particular objects and materials. Like we see this reflection on a sock. And I can imagine a 6-year-old boy being enthralled with going into the cabinet and looking at these socks. How many of you know the way he describes folding the socks? Stephanie, anyone else? So a few people. I don't know if anyone would be interested tomorrow afternoon, like if I could film some of you folding socks in that way and unfolding them, that'd be very helpful. Because most people I've spoken to in Germany, they say, like, I don't know what he's talking about. But then actually the subject, I think it's okay to say, is Olaf Zenker. I don't know if any of you know Olaf. He teaches in Halle. And I was talking to him one day and he said, yeah, I know exactly what he's talking about. And I said, can I film you, please? So we were out at a dinner one night last summer in Halle, and I brought my socks. They were clean. And I filmed him several times doing this. And he's comfortable with his hands being in the film in that way. So again, Benjamin describes houses, the logien, am I pronouncing it correct way? Or logien, which don't really exist so much anymore in Berlin, the way that he describes it. Courtyards, streets, children's books, sounds, photographs. And so it really is very rich field to work with in terms of the films. I don't think I could make films about Adorno the same way, because he's so intellectual. I don't think, he didn't write autobiographically the same way. And there's the wonder of appearance. And this is a wonderful quote from Hannah Arendt. What profoundly fascinated Benjamin from the beginning was never an idea, it was always a phenomenon. What seems paradoxical about everything that is justly called beautiful is the fact that it appears, and it's a wonderful phenomenological observation. And that's a quote from Benjamin. And this paradox, or more simply the wonder of appearance, was always at the center of all his concerns. And this wonder of appearance courses through the whole book, including the socks. And again, this is the collection of children's books I was mentioning before a few minutes ago. He has a wonderful section. We'll see the film tomorrow on the boys' books. And Benjamin had a collection of children's books that it was very valuable to him. He really cherished it. And he and his wife, Dora, would receive gifts from other people. So it's slowly collected. My understanding is that when he and Dora divorced, I think in 1929, she received a collection of children's books. And I'm sure that was very heartbreaking for him. And she kept them. She moved to Italy for a while and he would visit her. And I think he would see the books then. And then she moved to London and the book stayed with her. And now they're in the Goethe University in Frankfurt on Mom, is that how it's pronounced? Yeah. In a children's Institute for Children's Literature. And they've not only preserved the books and restored them, but they've scanned every book, every page, including the covers. And now it's public access. So I've been having a field day there, just going in and scanning images and using them in the films too. And again, you see this wonder of appearance. From what I understand, he wrote about the colors in these children's books and the color illustrations, just the wonder of appearance that he found wonderful, not just as a child, but as an adult. So he wrote about life and materiality. And then he writes at the beginning of the book about this is a kind of expeditions into the depths of memory. He's going back in time. So he's very interested in the complicated historical folds of time and memory. When he writes about Marcel Proust, he describes Proust's approach to writing and life as intertwined time. And I think that's a good concept for Benjamin as well, and treating history and memory as palimpsestic. And so I've been trying to do the same thing, to delve fully into the complex folds of temporality, memory, inscription, as well as the constant play of traces and erasures in our everyday lives and political and social situations, and working with those kind of themes. There's also the complexity of writing for Benjamin, these labyrinthian folds and cross currents in the writing, these multiplicities, things are multiple and shape-shifting. And so I wonder how the films could convey that as well. And Benjamin very much wrote with images, and people have describing like this. And it reminds me of, there's a kind of approach in anthropology today that some people have called like images method, to base your work either through writing or film or photography, not through just writing, but to invoke images through the work, as well as to think critically about images. And so the question I have is, how does one film with images? Benjamin was very interested in technology and perception, as many of you know. And this is a key quote of his from the Work of Art essay. Just as the entire mode of existence of human collectives changes over long historical periods, so too does their mode of perception. And I think we can all relate to that different cultural circumstances or historical settings, the nature of perception will be different. And so this is something to keep in mind as well. And then we on to history and experience. So one of my methods for filmmaking, I might have mentioned this last year, is working with this concept of rag picking. And this is what Benjamin wrote about, the chiffonnière of Paris, who would go around collecting rags, walking the streets calling out for people to collect the rags. And these are wonderful photographs by Auger, the great Parisian photographer from that time. And Benjamin writes about this as, he never describes himself as doing kind of rag picking, but I think it's clear that he's doing that through the Arcades Project and other things, where he would collect different materials, bits and pieces of things, and make something of them. And I think the way anthropologists often do it. And this has been my method, both with recent research I've done in Paris, but also with the Filmmaking project. I just go out, and if there's something I want to sort of collect in a way, I film it or I record it with an audio recorder. Last week, I was coming back from Antwerp in Belgium, and I really liked the sound of the train, and particularly the sound between the two cabins. It was a very quiet train, like around 10 o'clock at night. So I actually opened the doors, and I put my audio recorder in the middle between the two doors, and there's like clunk, 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 that kind of sound, which actually worked well, and it's in one of the films I'll show tomorrow. So Susan Sontag writes about Benjamin as a pearl picker. So the rags can actually be pearls. For a while, I didn't know why these rag pickers, these chiffonnières, would be collecting rags. And then I learned that they would use them to make paper, actually. So there's this wonderful transformative process that I'm sure appealed to Benjamin. So to employ rag picking as an ethnographic method. And so I've been trying to engage with that. And I was doing that in this Traces of Violence book that I completed a couple of years ago. So these are the kind of things I'm looking for: materials, artifacts, and traces, photographs. If I'm the cabinet that I showed at the beginning of the film, I typed in, what's the word for cabinet? Commode? For a drawer? Yeah. So I typed in commode, 1900, and what comes up? Antique stores who are selling commodes from 1900. Those are actually scanned, screenshots of the photographs they were selling. I mean, the photographs of the objects they were selling. Acoustic recordings, working with maps from around 1900, recording street art and graffiti of the present day, old postcards. So Tiergarten, some of us were talking about Tiergarten. This is an old map of Tiergarten, and I've been going there a lot to film. I haven't made this film yet, but in some ways I often find I'm tacking back and forth in time. Often when I go out, I have a bicycle in Berlin, and I carry a map like this to see where these places are and try to match it up with what's going on today. And usually it maps up fairly well. Sometimes it's quite different as well. So these are just some images I found online, which I'll use in the film on Tiergarten. This is the Hercules book. Brooke, okay, thank you. And I was there actually on Saturday. I wanted to film it for the film I'm making now on the Departure and Return. It was stupid of me because I went there at 5 o'clock and the sun is just behind the bridge. So the photograph would have been worthless with the film. So I have to go there in the morning because the sun will be behind me. But I was standing exactly in the same place. So some photographer took this in 1900, along the bridge. The bridge is different. There are these wonderful statues of Hercules and other Greek figures. I think they're in a museum in Berlin now. But the same flow of the river, and there's buildings behind the bridge in the same way, but they're different buildings. This is Bendlerstrasse, and this is Bendler Brook. And Benjamin describes, this is the first hill that he ever climbed, which if you're like 4 years old or 3 years old, it's significant because you're going up. But, this bridge still exists. I think it was rebuilt in 1950 or so. And he also has a wonderful section called Bloomshof 12, where his grandmother lived. And I think you can see Bloomshof, Bloom's courtyard. That street no longer exists. It's a youth hostel, which sometimes is used strangely as a police station too. This hospital still, the Elizabeth Kronken, still exists. Magdeburgplatz still exists. So again, this kind of intertwined time. He also writes about Market Hall, which has an interesting beginning where he says, first of all, no one said, if I can find it quickly, maybe someone will have some insight on this, because I've asked people about this as well, and it's unclear to them. First of all, one must not suppose that the covered market was called Markthalle. No, it was pronounced Markthalle. I don't know. That was just the shorthand people used at the time. I don't know. So that was a market hall, which no longer exists, but there's a park there. So I've been filming the park, the swing, there's a children's playground and a swing set. I'm very careful not to film people. I try not to have people too directly that they can be identified. So I have to find moments again to find where I can film, in these places. He describes in another section, this postcard that he had as a child of Hallstor, which is a little bit further east, which still exists. This statue still exists in the center of it. And he said that the postcard he had is the moon and the windows were cut out. And there was a transparency behind it, and you could hold it up to a light. It was like the moon was shining through it. So I think this is the postcard that he worked with. I found it online, and I had a student of mine who's an artist in the winter actually use a scalpel knife to cut these holes, and I want to film it with that way. So anything that I can create a kind of resemblance or engage with these themes. Some wonderful photographs by Heinrich Zille. I don't know if any of you are familiar with his work. He was also known as an artist based in Berlin. But he took these wonderful, which I think are very kind of vernacular photographs, almost ethnographic, of people who lived in Berlin, different places. And I've been able to use those in resourceful ways. This is just an example of, I've kept track of where I film on different days. So on February 15th last year, I was in Bloomshof and filming the field there. Genthener there's a furniture store, and you could just see I was filming the moon from the window on February 19th. That might be in the film. So again, very much like ethnography and then I need to keep track of where I'm filming so I can find things later on. And these are just the different files of the films where I usually put a date and then the main subject so I can find things. So it's like ethnographic research. There's certain methods involved. It's very low key. I don't really engage much with people. Some people come up with me, often speaking in German, like, oh, you're filming this bridge. I'm like, yeah. Collecting materials, the kind of waiting and patience that comes with field work, finding and choosing the right moments and being careful not to disturb anyone or trouble anyone. And then also I've been using a lot of archival research. And I talked with a colleague about this recently I think we're in this age where so much is now coming online, these digital archives that you can access in that way. But something is lost too, because you're not seeing the original things like the Benjamin's children's books. So it's very much a kind of integrative process. And to draw from Clifford Geertz, I'm really building toward a complex web of significance. Okay, so looking for all these kind of affinities. So maybe that gives you a sense of the kind of things that I'm working on, and we could see the film on the moon. Does that sound good? And we can always come back to these issues. So we have to go through, we didn't talk about multimodal phenomena. Maybe we can come back to that. Maybe I'll just show this quickly, and if we can hear the sound. So these are films I've done recently, and We'll see just a little bit more of this. Okay, we could stop there. So just to explain this is part of the film that I'll show tomorrow, Departure and Return. These are the train tracks that lead from where once stood Anhalter, the Anhalter terminus, which was one of the main train stations through the late 19th century, early 20th century, up until 1945, when it was destroyed through Allied bombing of Berlin. And Benjamin writes about this train station. It's one of the main ones that he would go on trips with his family in the summer on holiday. Anhalter was also used in the early 1940s as one of the transport centers to take Jewish peoples, particularly elderly Jewish people, out of Berlin and send them to Theresienstadt, and from there they would be sent to other places like Auschwitz. And this is one of the darker histories of the train station. Now, the only thing that remains is just the facade of the, where the beginning of the train station existed. And then you have all these train tracks in the park. Some of them like this, some just running through the woods. So I filmed there. And I've also combined it with, let's see, the earlier version you saw is this film. Some of you might be familiar with Berlin, The Symphony of a Great City, which is a kind of day of the life in Berlin, filmed by Walter Ruttmann. But there's one sequence early in the film, very beginning, where a train is coming from the south, maybe from this area, and slowly approaching Berlin. And it moves into the Anhalter station. So you actually see it coming into the terminus. So I've used that film and then combining it with these scenes from the park that I filmed a few weeks ago. I converted it to black and white, the more recent sequences, because someone told me it was too jarring to see the black and white film with the color film. But then also just this past week, I integrated these sound recordings I've made of trains, filming, trains and S-Bahns and U-Bahns in Berlin, as well as being on trains, to try to create the sense of a kind of spectral acoustic resonance within the film. I'm not sure if it works, but that's what I'm trying to do. So anyway, so we can come to the last. So this is the film Der Mond, the moon. And so we're just going to read some beginning passages with an expert assistant. So you can read that sentence.
Das Licht, welches vom Mond herunterfließt, gilt nicht dem Schauplatz unseres Tagesdaseins.
Thank you. The light that streams down, wait, we have one more. The light that streams down from the moon is not directed at the scene of our daily existence. So the text in the book is Der Mond, where Benjamin writes about this boy himself being disturbed by the moon at night, the light of the moon wakes him up at night. And he starts having these kind of existential questions like, how do I know I exist? How does I know the world exists? It's a very kind of unsettling kind of text. And one thing to note is that in the published version, one thing that's omitted that Benjamin decided to take out for the 1938 version is the earlier version he wrote about a dream he had of the moon. And this is the beginning of this.
Die Kindheit lag schon beinahe hinter mir. Da endlich schien gewillt, den Anspruch auf die Erde, den sonst nur bei Nacht erhoben hatte, vor ihrem Tagesantlitz anzumelden. Hoch überm Horizont, groß aber blass, stand im Himmel eines Traumes über den Straßen von Berlin.
And then in English, my childhood was almost behind me when the moon finally seemed willing to lay claim to the earth, which it had usually only done at night. High above the horizon, large but pale, it stood in the sky of a dream above the streets of Berlin. So I thought it'd be a shame not to include this narrative of the dream. And so that's, there's the text from 1938. And then I explained to any viewers that there's this other passage where he writes about the dream. I don't know why he took it out. Maybe he found it a little bit too much, too sensational, but he cut it out of the later version. So now we're going to see the film.
The light that streams down from the moon is not directed at the scene of our daily existence. The region that is illuminated by it seems to belong to an opposite or secondary Earth. This Earth is not the one that the moon follows as a satellite, but the Earth that has itself been transformed into a lunar satellite. Its broad bosom, whose breath was time, no longer stirs. At last creation has returned home and may now again don the widow's veil, which the day had torn away from her. The pale ray that penetrated through the wooden blinds made me understand this. My sleep was restless. The moon cut through it with its coming and going. When it was there in the room and I woke up, I was evicted, for it seemed to want to accommodate no one but the moon. The first thing that caught my eye were the two cream-colored basins of the washed sand. During the day, it never occurred to me to linger over them. But in the moonlight, the blue ribbon that ran along the top of the basins was cause for suspicion. It gave the illusion of a woven band snaking through a hem. And indeed, the rim of each basin was pleated like a ruffle. Sturdy jugs stood in the middle of the two basins, made of the same porcelain and with the same floral pattern. When I got out of bed, they would clink, and this clinking continued on from the marble covering of the wash stand to its basins and bowls. But as happy as I was to detect a sign of life in my nocturnal surroundings, even if it was only the echo of my own, it was an unreliable one, waiting to deceive me, like a false friend. This happened when I raised my hand with the carafe to pour water into a glass. The gurgling of this water, the sound with which I first put down the carafe and then the glass, everything struck my ear as repetition. For all the places of that secondary earth to which I had been carried away seemed to be occupied by what once had been. I had to surrender to it. When I returned to bed, it was always with the fear of finding myself already stretched out upon it. The anxiety only subsided completely when I felt the mattress against my back again. Then I would fall asleep. The moonlight would slowly fade from my room. And often it was already dark when I awoke for a second or third time. My hand had to be the first to emerge from the trench of sleep in which it had taken cover from a dream. When the nightlight, flickering, had soothed my hand in me, it turned out that there was nothing left of the world but a single stubborn question. It was, why is there anything at all in the world? Why is the world? I was astonished to discover that nothing in it could compel me to think of the world. Its non-being would not have seemed a whit more questionable to me than its being, which seemed to wink at non-being. The ocean and its continents had had little advantage over my washstand when the moon was still shining. Of my own existence, there was nothing left but the dregs of its abandonment. You have just heard the 1938 version of Walter Benjamin's Der Mond. The moon shines into a boy's bedroom, disrupting his sleep and his consciousness, and a nightscape of uncanny doubles and existential doubts and questions ensues. The light streaming into the boy's room works much like a camera does, with the moonlight establishing a secondary scene of life and spectral possibilities within the camera obscura of the child's bedroom. I have been trying in turn to turn the camera toward the moon so as to film the moon as it passes over Berlin. I have since become reacquainted with the moon's rhythms and movements and ever-changing nature. I find the Der Mond text to be a rather phenomenological one, for it conveys the life world and night world of a young boy on the periphery of sleep and dreaming as he encounters the moon's hypnotic force. Filmic sequences of the moon can perhaps convey a similar kind of intensity. In an earlier version of Timon, included in the 1932-34 version of Berliner Kindheit, Benjamin writes of a dream he once had as a child. He omitted this passage from the 1938 version of the text. For me, the dream anticipates histories of violence that would emerge in Europe in the 20th century, in which Benjamin and his family directly experienced. This is what Benjamin wrote about the dream. My childhood was almost behind me when the moon finally seemed willing to lay claim to the earth. which it had usually only done at night. High above the horizon, large but pale, it stood in the sky of a dream above the streets of Berlin. It was still light outside. My family was gathered around, a little rigid, as if in a daguerreotype. Only my sister was missing. "Where is Dora?" I heard my mother cry. The moon, which had been full in the sky, had suddenly expanded, ever faster. Coming closer and closer, it tore the planet apart. The railing of the iron balcony on which we had all sat above the streets fell to pieces, and the bodies that had populated it quickly crumbled apart on all sides. The funnel formed by the approaching moon sucked everything into itself. Nothing could hope to pass through it untransformed.
Okay, so that's it. This is just one last sequence. And anyone recognize where this is? Yeah, Temple, yeah. It's very unique. It's a wonderful place. For those of you who might not know, this used to be an airfield, which is now just this big open expanse that people really like and appreciate. And from what I understand, when there was the Berlin airlift, this is where they dropped the flights dropped the provisions for people when Berlin was getting blockaded. And obviously this was the day of a full moon. It was just rising.